Well, thank you very much. This very interesting discussion on the European Parliament and about Europe. I would agree with what Helmut said, that the vote is a picture in time, and it's not the movie to see all the developments. So we need to look at the trends. And of course, I will bring my personal experience, but I'll try to use it to bring some light on the difficulties and trends that we are facing. Greece, of course, after the elections, I would say remains politically stable. There will be no immediate, I believe, change in government. There is, as the head of the Eurogroup said, we have a primary surplus, the biggest fiscal adjustment of any OECD country ever. And there's been a huge sacrifice by the Greek people. But it would be a wrong conclusion to say that we need to just continue with business as usual, because that was a bit what the message I heard from the head of the Eurogroup, that, well, we have difficulties, but we just need to continue to plod along. I think sometimes I look at the problem a little bit in the terms of some ancient Greek fables. One, of course, is the Odyssey, where, yes, we have a very difficult road ahead of us, but there is Ithaca at the end. We can reach it. The other one is Sisyphus, where we are simply being punished to push a rock up the hill, and all that happens, it rolls on the other side, and we're still pushing it up. So I think we need to think out of the box and not get into this thing of just simply plodding along and that everything will be fine and we were just on the right track. If we talk about Greece, and we, of course, were responsible for a mismanaged economy, and I inherited this and had to deal with it. And we are the first to say so. But I would like to see the other side. How did Europe respond to the problem that Greece had? And I think this is where we can see some of the problems, and it links at some point with the electoral results. What was our common response? Well, first of all, I think one of the mistakes we made was, and are still somewhat making in our rhetoric, is the austerity versus reform, I would call it. We needed real reform in Greece. The political system, more transparency. As a matter of fact, Brookings Institute has a study that says if we were as transparent as Sweden, my dear friend Leif Pagrotsky is here from Sweden, if we were as transparent as Sweden in our governance system, we would gain 8 percentage points of GDP. Now that's pretty close to the whole adjustment program we made simply by cuts. So I would also add to that that the cutting of wages may make us slightly more competitive, but let's take a company. If a company is producing a product which is not being bought on the market because people don't like the product, cutting the price of that product is not necessarily going to make that product lucrative, interesting for the consumer. So we really needed to reorganize our economy, reorganize our company, if you like. Innovation, reorganization, training, new technology, new design, reorganizing our whole industry and our whole economy. That takes time. Another example is the tax system. Well, you can raise taxes in order to cut your deficit, but if you have a bad tax system, that is where the real problem lies. So I think this is one of the major problems we had. Secondly, of course, I remember Gerhard Schröder always was telling me he could never have made the reforms in Germany if he had to do both things at the same time, both reforms and austerity, and he chose reforms over austerity. We did, I would say, the opposite, although we have made many reforms. But at the same time, we have created a backlash because we have huge youth unemployment because of this austerity, which has made reforms more difficult. So you have a safety net which is not there for the unemployed. I heard, again, the head of the Eurogroup say that, Urian Dijsselbloem, that we need to train people. But what if you don't have the money? What if you don't have that safety net to train the youth during the time when they're unemployed? But this is where Europe could play a role. For example, with an Erasmus for the unemployed. Why not? A second point I want to make in how we dealt with this problem is that, and it's very pertinent to, I think, what's happening in Europe, is we had a national narrative as to what the problem was. So, and this was very, very much so at the very beginning. Less so now, but still quite dominant. Greece was the problem. It was not a Greek problem, it was Greece that was the problem. Then it became the South or the periphery that became the problem of Europe. Which basically was a very nice narrative because it said, listen, Eurozone does not have a problem, Europe does not have a problem. These are problems that each country has to solve on its own. So there's no collective responsibility. So we didn't look at the imbalances that the Eurozone actually had. And there were quite a few, and there still are. Well, the banking system. We are now 7 years after the banking crisis, 7 years after the banking crisis, and we still have not solved the banking problem, which means credit to the real economy is still not there. When the US did it in 2009, the banking union is very important, but there are still quite a few, I would say, flaws. The question of the bond markets, very different reactions to different countries. The surpluses, the strength of the euro, labor mobility, and minimum standards. These are issues which have nothing to do with one country. They have to do with imbalances which our Eurozone has. As a matter of fact, when in the early period of this decade, or the previous decade of 2000, the euro was very important to stem growth in the periphery and even create bubbles, while Germany was in recession and had difficulties because of the imbalances of the Eurozone, of the rate of the ECB, for example, the interest rate. So these are issues we have to look at as not simply national. Yes, we have to put our house in order, but there are imbalances in Europe. What, however, did this do to the political narrative? Because that's very important, which came out, I think, from this European election. It fed in to a blame game. Oh, these lazy Southerners, or these austere Northerners, stereotypes, even an underlying racism, which fed in to all the populists and ultra-right movements, the xenophobia that has been around in Europe over the past years. So we fed into this rhetoric, I think, which was very negative, but this fueled then these movements. And that brings me to another point of democracy, because I think one thing that is also very important is the sense of powerlessness facing these problems that people have and our citizens have. And particularly the sense of ownership of the European project. How much do people really feel they own the European project? I, of course, you know, at some point proposed a referendum. The reason I wanted the referendum was I felt we needed to give the Greek people the opportunity to own their decision, whether it was a positive one or a negative one. I thought we would have won the referendum, but whatever it would have been their ownership of that decision, which is very important, and not simply something imposed from a bureaucracy or a technocracy. And the reaction I had, of course, from some of the leaders in the European Union were, you're putting the markets at risk. The risks will be huge in the European and international bond markets. But my response, of course, was yes, that is a risk. But in the end, the risk is more in the politics, which we now see after the electoral vote of yesterday, the day before yesterday. The political risk is that we alienate our citizens from our decisions. They do not own these decisions, and then they react, or at least a large part of the citizens react to these decisions in being exploited very often by an anti-European or populist feeling. So I think that this is deeply a democratic issue, and I think that it's the excellent research that both Simon and Catherine talked about, how we also look at the European Parliament, how we make it more accountable. Frank also mentioned this. I think one of the questions with the European Parliament, which I understand still remains one of the most popular institutions in the European Union. However, who really decides? From the citizens' point of view and the media point of view, what does a European citizen see, and what did I also see myself? First of all, I have been in European councils for many years because I was foreign minister. Before the Lisbon Treaty, foreign ministers would sit next to the prime minister in all the European councils. So for maybe over 8 years, I have sat in European councils. First of all, the Commission, I felt this time, was pretty much non-existent. So we have a weak, very weak Commission. Secondly, the European Parliament did take stands, very important stands, and they did take initiatives, but they didn't really, nobody really felt that they had much of a say in formulating the policy during this major financial crisis. They made lots of noises, they created committees, they even had a very important commission that came to see how the Troika was working and came up with a report. But in formulating policies, they really did not have much of an effect. So the Council was basically the one that made the decisions. But the Council of 27 and now 28 ended up, and a very different Council from what I remember when we were 15 or even fewer, 12, ended up being simply France and Germany meeting before the Council, coming with a decision already made, and of course the decision was tilted in what Germans' view was. And some people can justify this by saying, you know, during a crisis we may have to make quick decisions, we don't have time to deliberate, we don't have time to think about things, but we made many mistakes because of that. And had we had the institutions to really deliberate between the Commission, the Parliament, and maybe even our citizens, I think we would have come up with much better solutions. But that means that why would one go to vote in for the European Parliament if they feel that the European Parliament, in the end, even though it has gained much more power in the treaties, and maybe even informal powers, it still is not as strong as one would think in the eyes of our citizens. Of course, the Spitzenkandidat did play a role, but I would agree with you, Frank, that it may play a role more with somehow enhancing the power of the Parliament rather than linking our citizens with the institutions. Just two more points because I'm running out of time. I think there's another question as far as democracy is concerned. Can we have democracy beyond borders? Can we identify with each other even though we're different nations? From ancient Athens to France, there was always a sense of identity. Maybe through more participation we can create more identity, which is an education in itself. Maybe that will help the European demos, as Catherine mentioned, and of course Habermas talks about. I will end with one important point. We often talk about Europe as if we are isolated and how the developments in Europe. But I think one of the problems that our citizens have, or at least we have as Europeans, and maybe are not dealing with or dealing with in a way which is not an added value for our citizens, is what is happening around the globe, a globalizing economy. How much is Europe affecting, putting down the rules of this globalizing economy? How much is our model becoming a dominant model, our social contract? How much is our belief in human rights, our belief in democracy, how much is that being a dominant model? The types of regulations. Well, in the past, we could negotiate these issues, employers, employees, and the state, social partners, at the national level. But this global economy, capital has moved beyond our borders. So we really have no one to negotiate with. They can do what they want. They have no nation, if you like. As some American economists told me, patriotism is to profit and not to the citizens. So are we going to do move on a race to the bottom? Well, less collective bargaining, labor standards, environmental standards, human rights, pension systems, welfare systems? Is it going to be a race to the bottom to be competitive with emerging markets? Or are we going to invest in our citizens? And yes, we will need certain taxes to invest, or maybe use the project Eurobonds to create a sustainable green growth in Europe, in quality, in training, in research, in infrastructure, in energy grids, energy policy and autonomy. Are we going to do this, which would make us competitive in quality and not simply in a race to the bottom? And I just want to take one point on this. When I was looking at the tax issue, one of our major problems was that we have tax havens. We have the mobility of capital. And at every council, I said, yes, I want to collect taxes from Greece, and we're changing our tax system, but we have tax havens and tax avoidance around the world, which is robbing revenues from our citizens. And this is where we need concerted European effort. This is where it shows that if we work at a collective level, maybe we can create better rules and regulation at the global level, which will bring in more justice and better standards, not only for the Europeans, but also for many parts of the world. However, the response was very meek. There was lip service to this, of course. Even at the G20, there is lip service to these ideas, but little in real global governance. Europe is a model, is an experiment of what global governance can be. However, if we do not see that Europe will become a real force of humanizing globalization, then globalization will dehumanize our European project. And people will see that Europe may not be that added value which we had expected it to be. I'm not in any way agree with the populists around Europe, but I do believe that they have been able to exploit some real problems which we need to be honest and think about in creating a deeper integration, more economic, social, energy, and defense common policies, but with a much deeper democracy. Thank you very much.